Okay, the War of Northern Aggression Part 2. This was all Lincoln's fault. If he hadn't been elected, the South wouldn't have ceded. The Northern capitalists would not now be in this mess. So, as president-elect, Lincoln prepared to take over the presidency. He was in a world of hurt. He had the trappings of office, but not the power base to support him safely in office against the slings and arrows of his outrageous political enemies. Both Seward and Chase had well-established power bases, financial backers, newspapers, magazines, personal political organizations, friends in Congress, etc. Both of them badly wanted Lincoln's job. Both of them merely awaited the first opportunity to spring a political trap on him, then subject him to deadly public ridicule and thereafter cut him off at the knees. Given time, Lincoln, who would, after all, occupy the presidency, could wield together a formidable power base of his own, but right at the beginning of his term, he was perilously vulnerable. He must now have the support of the Northern capitalists. Lincoln was a Whig masquerading as a Republican. Because that was the first Republican president was a rhino. Because that was now the only game in town. He didn't care anything about the slavery issue. He preferred to temporize with the abolitionists, but he couldn't temporize with the Northern capitalists. He would have to drag the South back into the Union immediately, or he'd figuratively be shot out of the saddle and discredited very quickly. Then Seward or Chase would really be running the country, and Lincoln could forget all about being reelected in 1864. That was unthinkable, but there was no way Lincoln or anyone else in the Republican Party could possibly talk the Southern states back into the Union at this stage in the game. So he would have to conquer them in war. He assumed it would be a 90-day war, which the Union Army could win in one battle. If you read Lincoln's first inaugural address with any care at all, you'll see that it was simply a declaration of war against the South. It was also filled with lies and suspicious reasoning. In 1861, the official government charter of the U.S. and the U.S. Constitution, in writing it, the delegates of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, some of the most canny politicians in the country, had pointedly omitted from it the Perpetual Union Clause, which had been a main feature of the unworkable Articles of Confederation of Perpetual Union, the U.S. government charter which had preceded the Constitution and was thrown out when we wrote the one that actually worked. Under the Articles, no state could succeed lawfully unless all states ceded simultaneously. But the Constitution, which Lincoln had just taken an oath to uphold, did not contain that clause or any like it. So any state could succeed lawfully at any time. And the Southern states did cede lawfully. Honest Abe flat out lied when he said that was not so in his inaugural address. And he subsequently used this blatant lie to slaughter 623,000 Americans and Confederates, primarily in order to perpetuate himself in his political office. Lincoln had said that he would go to war to preserve the Union, but in order to start the war, he would somehow have to maneuver the South into firing the first shots. But Congress did not want war and would not declare war of its own volition. The most likely hot spot in which Lincoln could start his war was Charleston Harbor. There were shots had already been fired in anger under the Buchanan administration, but the newly elected governor of South Carolina, Francis Pickens, saw the danger that Lincoln might, as an excuse, send a force of the U.S. Navy warships to Charleston Harbor, supposedly to bring food to Major Anderson's Union force holed up in Fort Sumter. So Governor Pickens opened negotiation with Major Anderson and concluded a deal permitting Anderson to send boats safely to the market in Charleston once a week, where Anderson's men would be allowed to buy whatever vitals that they wished. This arrangement remained in effect until a day or so before the U.S. Navy warships arrived at Charleston. Major Anderson wrote privately to friends saying that he hoped Lincoln would not use Fort Sumter as an excuse to start a war by sending the U.S. Navy to resupply it. Before his inauguration, Lincoln sent a secret message to General Winfield Scott, the U.S. General-in-Chief, asking him to make preparations to relieve the Union forts in the South soon after Lincoln took office. Lincoln knew all along what he was going to do. Okay? President Jefferson Davis sent peace commissions to Washington to negotiate a treaty with the Lincoln administration. Lincoln refused to meet with them, and he refused to permit Secretary of State Seward to meet with them. After Lincoln assumed the presidency, his principal generals recommended the immediate evacuation of Major Anderson's men from Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, which was now located on foreign soil. To resupply it by force at this point would be a deliberate act of war against the CSA. It turned out that Lincoln's Postmaster General Montgomery Blair had a brother-in-law, Gustavus V. Fox, who was a retired Navy captain and wanted to get back into action. Fox had come up with a plan for resupplying Fort Sumter, which would force the Confederates to fire the first shots, under circumstances which would make them take the blame for the war. Lincoln sent Fox down to Fort Sumter to talk with Major Anderson about the plan, but Anderson wanted no part of it. Lincoln had Fox pitch the plan to his cabinet twice. The first time, the majority said that Fox's plan would start a war and were unenthusiastic about it. But the second time, the cabinet members got Lincoln's pointed message and agreed. Meanwhile, Congress got wind of the plan. Horrified, they called General Scott and others to testify about it. Scott and the other witnesses said they wanted no part of the move against the Confederacy in Charleston, nor did Congress. Congress demanded from Lincoln, as was Congress's right, that Fox's report on Major Anderson's reaction to the plan. Lincoln flatly and unconstitutionally refused to hand it over to them. Lincoln sent to the Secretary Cameron for transmittal to Secretary Wells orders in his own handwriting to make warships Pocahontas and Pawnee and the armed cutter Harriet Lane ready for sailing, along with the passenger ship Baltic, which would be used as a troop ship, and 2 ocean-going tugboats to aid the ships in traversing the tricky shallow harbor entrance at Charleston. This naval force was to transport 500 extra Union soldiers to reinforce Major Anderson's approximately 86-men force at Fort Sumter, along with the huge quantities of munitions, food, and other supplies. The Confederacy would, of course, resist this invasion. In the process, firing upon the U.S. flag, the unarmed tugs would, of necessity, enter the harbor first, whereupon they would likely be fired upon by the CSA, giving Lincoln the best possible propaganda to feed Northern newspapers, which would then rally the North in its cause. All right, and we are going to pick this up at part 3.